Well, our next speaker is Bud Freeman, who's director of the Georgia Museum of Natural History. However, Bud had to have surgery yesterday, and so I'm his stunt double today, which is, I'd rather be Bud's stunt double than Tom Cruise's stunt double because I won't have to drive a motorcycle off a cliff. But I wish he was here. He's so well regarded for his many, many years beyond working simply as the director of the Georgia Natural History Museum, but he has conducted extensive field and laboratory investigations all across the Southeast into every sort of plant and animal that you can imagine. And we all are sending him our best wishes. So fortunately, Bud and I had talked about a month ago about his talk. And so I will pretend to be Bud. At least he was born in Northwest Georgia, close to the Etowah Mounds, so we have a similar accent. So I will stand in for Bud today. And this is our discussion is going to be about finding Bartram's fish. Perhaps everyone in this room who's read Bartram's travels has their own interpretation of what's important about it. For me, now this is Bud speaking, for me as someone who studies fish, I'm always on the lookout for any mention Bartram makes of the fish he saw during his travels in the Southeast. And being a native Georgian, I pay particular attention to what he had to say about what he saw here. Of course, Bartram's strong suit was botany, but he was a keen observer of much, much more in the Southern landscape. So, like a fish, I'm attracted to his fish descriptions that lure me in like a fine trout fly or even a jelly worm. That's Bud speaking. Of course, we're marking the 250th anniversary of his journey through Northeast Georgia, accompanying the party surveying the new purchase. And you've just heard about the buffalo lick, Brad. Brad's location now is complemented by where Bud lives, who says, I'm fortunate to live on a high scarp overlooking the Broad River, a place Bartram visited during the survey and at other times as well. I look down on those waters, walk them with friends in search of fish, hear Bartram's description of what he saw there, and reflect on what we have nearly lost, and what Bartram and so many of us never knew was there. So let's start with one of Bartram's descriptions, which tells us what he observed as he peered down through the waters of the Broad River, once as nearly transparent as the springs he was entranced by in Florida. As the survey party made its way on its beeline to close in on the Savannah River, Bartram writes that he and some companions made a side trip to visit the Hudson and Broad Rivers. On this jaunt, he writes about two different sets of encounters with fish. First, this one of his most memorable accounts in all of his natural history. The waters at which this place, still and shoal, and flowed over a bed of gravel just beneath the rocky rapid. In this eddy shoal, there were a number of gravelly pyramidal hills whose summits rose almost to the surface of the water, very artfully constructed by a species of small crayfish which inhabited them. Here seemed to be their citadel or place of retreat for their young against the attacks and ravages of their enemy, the goldfish. These in numerous bands continually infested them, except at short intervals when small detachments of veteran crayfish sallied upon them from their cells within the gravelly pyramids, at which time a brilliant fight presented. The little goldfish instantly fled from every side, darting through the transparent waters like streams of lightning. Some even sprang above the surface into the air, but all quickly returned to the charge, surrounding the pyramids as before, on the retreat of the crayfish. In this manner, the war seemed to be continual. The goldfish is about the size of the anchovy, nearly 4 inches long, of a neat, slender form. The head is covered with a salade of ultramarine blue, the back of a reddish brown, the sides and belly of a flame or of the color of a fine red lead. A narrow, dusky line runs along each side from the gills to the tail. The eyes are large, with the iris like burnished gold. Wouldn't you love to be described that way? So these are yellowfin shiners, Notropis lutipinus. And here's our next person in the show. And this is not Bartram, this is back to Bud. As for the pyramid building crayfish, Bartram missed the lead actor in the scene he described, the bluehead chub. As the spring spawning season approaches, the males undergo a dramatic transformation. The head turns bright blue, ornamented with short tubercles. How about that? That's a real attractive feature, at least for a bluehead chub in the mating season. And bulging above the eyes. Equally important as these body signals is the male's behavior. With his narrow lips, he moves gravel bit by bit, as many as 14,000 grains, to construct a mound up to 3 square feet in area and as high as 5 inches above the river bottom. The quality of the structure, along with the brilliance of the male's coloration, advertises his fitness to discerning females. Taking advantage of the chub's behavior, the yellowfin shiner and crayfish use this mound for their own reproductive efforts. Without him, there'd be nothing. Because the male chub is so intent on protecting his territory and keeping it free from silt, the shiner and the crayfish benefit not only from a skilled builder and maintenance man, but also a devoted security guard. So Bartram was correct in his description of the yellowfin shiner in spawning colors, and the crayfish too. But a man on the move sees through a narrow window, and without seeing the bluehead chub, Bartram's words make up in their vivacity for the more interesting story it lacks in fact. Now Bartram's description of his visit to the Broad immediately continues with another fish sighting. And this is right together on the same page. One of our young Indian men this evening caught a very large salmon trout weighing about 15 pounds, which he presented to the colonel, who ordered it to be served up for supper. The Indian struck this fish with a reed harpoon, pointed and very sharp, barbed and hardened by the fire. The fish lay close under the steep bank, which the Indian discovered and struck with his reed. Instantly, the fish darted off with it, whilst the Indian pursued without extracting the harpoon, and with repeated thrusts, drowned it and then dragged it to shore. That's one way to catch your evening meal. Bartram calls it a salmon trout. If you're not familiar with that term, don't try looking it up on the web these days, because that name is often used to describe steelhead trout for sale at the grocery store, seafood counter. Those fillets in the cooler come from a fish whose native range is the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, not Northeast Georgia. So what was this 15-pound fish whose behavior was so familiar to the young native man that he knew exactly how to find it and to spear it? Based on descriptions of its size and coloration, it was probably this fish. The salmon trout is a robust red horse, and it's truly robust when you look at it alongside. This is not the Indian. This is someone who works for DNR for either South Carolina or Georgia. It's not a largemouth bass or a salmon, but what Bartram was describing was a female robust red horse, which also spawns in these gravel shoals along with the yellowfin shiner and the bluehead chub. Actually, the yellowfin shiners can also be attracted to these large gravel mounds that accrue behind the robust red horse when they're in the way of spawning. So the yellowfin shiners are real opportunists in this story. Well, whatever they're called locally, robust red horse historically were quite easily seen and not unusual at all until the advent of damming rivers and creeks for water power. These fish are migratory and congregate for spawning in clear, shoaly water for mating and egg laying. And I'll show you why Bartram was correct in calling them a salmon trout. Here's an artist's rendition of what they actually look like. And here you can see that during mating season, its coloration changes, and hence the salmon color that certainly is evident in the fins and then also has a cast along the body. As the female moves into the mainstream to begin laying her eggs, a male flanks her on either side to fertilize the tiny eggs as they sink and then nestle among the gravel in the stream bed. There they'll remain protected until they hatch. And the importance to all of these fish, but particularly to the robust red horse, is the shoaly, fast-flowing water. For the females, between bouts of egg laying, they retire to the border of the rivers where the current is less strong, and they often rest there in the overhang of the banks, a behavior which didn't go unnoticed by native peoples, thus leading to the fish Bartram had for dinner. Of course, as settlements crept into the new purchase, these shoaly areas became prime sites for mill dams to supply water power. And one of our most picturesque places, although not of colonial vintage, is this site, the Watson Mill Bridge State Park just east of Athens. Quite picturesque with its long covered bridge that spans the shoals of the broad river, but it's hardly picturesque to a migratory fish like the robust red horse trying to make its way upstream to the best spawning grounds. No fish is going to be able to leap that mill dam. And so now, in order to restore these fish to the habitat that they formerly occupied, we need human intervention of another type, with efforts to restock the robust red horse into favorable habitats in an effort to return this impressive fish, there's no doubt about how impressive the size is, to its home waters. But before we leave this, here's something else about Bartram's observations of all these fish that we learned when we combine what he described with what we know now. Throughout travels, Bartram knew how to tell a story that would keep his readers engaged. It's a combination of science and travel writing, and thus sometimes he inserts anecdotes where they might make a better flow for the reader rather than reporting everything that happened in strict chronological order. We, ichthyologists, now know that Bartram could not have seen the fish behavior he reports that he saw in August of 1773. These fish, the yellowfins, the chubs, the robust red horse, behave the way he described only in spring. Thus, he probably observed these fish the following year when he made another foray into the upper reaches of the Savannah River Valley. So, we've covered things that we still have, the blue chub building its pyramids, and what we've nearly lost, the robust red horse. Well, what about the things that Bartram didn't mention? We always have, any of us who've read Bartram know that he leaves out things we really want to know about. What he didn't mention and what we nearly didn't realize we had, and that's a species of bass, for better or worse, commonly referred to as the Bartram bass. And these lovely Bartram bass beer glasses are available at the auction table. So everybody must have one, plus they're shaped like a beer can. So now we move on to the Bartram bass. Bud told me a story that he didn't write down, but I'll tell it to you. He was working on the Broad River, working with Mike Moody way back in the 80s, and was retrieving some boats or was down at the river. And after he came ashore, there were a couple of people who had been fishing. And he asked, as an ichthyologist, he asked, "What you got? What y'all catch? What you catching?" And they opened up the cooler, and there lying on the top of everything else on the ice was this enormous bass, a bass like that Bud had never seen before. And he said to him, "I'll give you $5 for that bass." And they said, "We're going to eat it." So he missed out on the bass. But Bud still thinks about that bass very deeply and very personally, about the one that really got away. A skilled ichthyologist should know when they see something that looks different and strange, and how this quest, for better or worse, to attempt to identify a new species of bass has occupied Bud physically and mentally for the last 40 years or so. Now, Bartram had it easy when he was in the South, because scientifically he was describing for the first time 43 new species of plants and 20 species of animals. He was describing plants in his field notes, sending herbarium specimens back to Philadelphia, along with seeds and cuttings. For the animal species, he augmented his written descriptions of how they looked and behaved with skins and skeletons that could be sent back to his colleagues. Sometimes his written descriptions alone were enough for taxonomists to declare a completely new species. There's a great instance from Florida. He described the non-migratory Florida sandhill crane in great detail, and then he and the rest of the party ate it for dinner. Despite the absence of a specimen, his description alone was accepted by taxonomists as valid in 1794, based simply on what he wrote about the bird in travel. Contrast that process with the current interest by a working group of ichthyologists in Georgia and South Carolina in meeting the modern requirements for naming a new species of shoal bass. So you couldn't have gotten away with eating the shoal bass, even if you wrote a good description of it. Now, the scientific name of the shoal bass is Microterus coosi. And so for all you people in Alabama, that's for the Coosa River. So if you have something to be proud of in addition to having Catherine with you. The map on the left, we have the laser pointer here. I won't burn a hole in the screen. This map here on the left shows the general distribution of what are known commonly as red-eye bass, whereas the map on the right shows in more detail the distribution of these various types of the fish in Alabama, Georgia, and into South Carolina. Notice that in general, these common names that we see here on the map on the right, and also to a certain extent over here, these common names are taken from the watersheds in which these bass species are found, except for this one over here in brown, the Bartram bass in the Savannah River watershed. Now, just like the robust red horse was blocked by smaller dams at Watson Mill, imagine what the effects are of dams this size on fish populations. This next map comes from the Corps of Engineers, and it shows all the dams in the Savannah River watershed. Helpfully, there's not one right here at the mouth, but even as low down in the watershed as Augusta, you have this navigation dam. Of course, there are smaller dams, but these are the ones that are operated by the Corps of Engineers. And then you see these major dams like the Strom Thurmond, the Richard Russell, the Hartwell Dam. It always pays to be a senator. You get, now you say a dam senator instead of a senator's dam. But look at all these tremendous impoundments. And then as you get even higher in the watershed, these smaller dams still are blocking these migratory pathways. So not only are you blocking the migratory pathways, but think about all those tributary streams and even rivers, all that habitat which now lie beneath those impoundments. You flooded out a substantial number of native fish. And so to remedy that, we have Let's Go Fishing, where the Game and Fish agencies restock the lake on a regular basis to provide these fishermen with an impressive haul. But if you're restocking with fish from other watersheds, then you wind up with this headline where this just came out, where look at this, hybrids, all right? And in some cases, the introduced fish, like the enormous striped bass, which sometimes emerge from the depths like cruise missiles on the lakes I've been on Paddle, Georgia. Those are such efficient predators that they are eating up the native bass. So between the introduction of hybrids from other watersheds, and then other fish that are being brought in, it's like the good old iconic Bassomatic, but it's a slower speed. And we're all dating ourselves because that came from 1976 from Saturday Night Live, and we'll never forget it. All right, so there's your levity, your comic relief. Okay, so here we go. This is a more detailed map of the upper part of the Savannah River watershed. You can see the inset here going from about Augusta upwards. And it looks complicated, but the only thing to focus on is the little gray parts of the pie charts. Just take a moment and look at that. You can see the variation here as we move up the watershed. So this shows these are the major dams and even some of those high up in the watershed, and the degree of the hybridization of the bass now found there. So often it's only the smaller streams, the streams off the main branch, the small tributaries that feed into the Savannah, where these endemic bass are able to compete against these introduced species. So let us go back to our color slide again. Think about where so much development is taking place today. Alterations in these smaller stream landscapes in the uplands of these systems is beginning to accelerate again. And so what we're facing with these kind of developments, Shirley. Okay, Shirley, that's fine. Yeah, all right. John's from South Carolina, so he wants to make sure he knows what's going on this side of the border too. So as we experience more vacation homes, more development, more expansion out into these areas away from the more centralized population centers, we're looking at habitat loss, degradation of water quality, and loss of biodiversity in many of these smaller streams. And so in closing, what Bud would have me say is that for our Bartram story, the introduction of these non-native bass is posing a serious challenge to the continued existence of both the Alabama bass, all the Alabamians here, and the Bartram bass as genetically distinct species. Bud's task in this project as part of this state, South Carolina, Georgia program is to determine which specimens are really Bartram's bass or not, and then writing a formal scientific description of the new species based on their genetics, basically a 23andMe for fish, alongside traditional taxonomy like scale counts, the color, the internal anatomy, things an observant biologist such as Bartram, or hopefully Brad, would recognize and get right. Unfortunately, the description of species like Bartram's bass, which are facing system-wide hybridization challenges, may depend on these near pure populations, usually found high in the watersheds and in relatively modest numbers. Their recovery and conservation may well depend on our learning to value them too. And I want to close with this picture. This is Bud and his wife, Mary Freeman, also an eminent ichthyologist. This is a marriage truly made in heaven. And they're the only people I know who have had a species of fish named for them. This is the Persina freemanorum. If it's two people or more than one person that share the last name, they make it freemanorum. And it's the Etowah bridal darter. And it's quite a thing to not have to wait until you're dead to have something named for you. So I hope this I'll be happy to try and answer any questions on anything. My knowledge of the depth of genetics is rudimentary, but that's what I have to say on behalf of Bud. And I know that we all wish him a speedy recovery so that he can continue both his field work and lab work to finally bring us to the point of having an official Bartram bass. Thank you. Yes, shoal bass is kind of a umbrella term. There are various different types of it, but it is in the shoal bass, group. And all of these have in common that they are caught in shoaly waters. And so if you go to Anthony Shoals in Elberton, and I've read descriptions of people who fish there for shoal bass and who are very deeply involved with helping to identify Bartram's bass. They're not ichthyologists, but they're people who fish who know what they're looking at, and so they often will catch them up in the channel way, and people who really enjoy fishing for shoal bass, a lot of times it's catch and release. It's more fun, not for the fish, but it's more fun for the fishermen to have a lively fish on the line and then release it so that it can go on and make more fish. Yes, Mike.
Well, the Broad River is really special. Right? The Anthony Shoals, it acts like everything upstream has no influence on all the higher downstream.
Yes. Yes.
So they just got through replacing one bridge in the Broad, and it took forever to do this pylon. What are you doing? They mentioned shoal bass and
robust red horse. Yeah, it's been. Bud also, I've known Bud since 1970, so I've heard a lot of stories. But he talked about working on the robust red horse, and they were catching them, and they were going to take them to the hatchery. It's where they could raise them and the young in captivity and release them. And they were very carefully bringing these fish in, and there was at the parking lot or the boat landing, this guy said, "What is that good for?" And Bud said, he looked at him and said, "What are you good for?" and I mean, and then they had a really nice conversation, but it was, it's like, well, how do you value something? And even the people who fish for shoal bass, not necessarily for things that they know are in peril, but shoal bass often are in the same places where people are fishing for trout. And the trout people can't understand why you would eat one of those because it's so bony. And so there's this real dichotomy between people who are fly fishing for bass and people who are fly fishing for trout. But they both need the same thing. They need clean, clear, undammed waters. Yes, Brent. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Well, it sounds pretty brutal having to chase it and beat it to death in the shoals on the Broad River. It's tenderizer. There you go. But yeah, they can be eaten. They're a sucker. Their bottom, if you look, their mouth is underslung like that, so they're feeding on the bottom. And I don't know what it is, but first of all, they're not common, and so people don't catch them, and then they don't eat them. But But they're a really, really interesting fish, and they're found not only in the Broad, but in the Okmulgee shoals. They in many of anywhere there's these shoaly places, and of course they have a range larger than Georgia. But I have to talk about Georgia. So yes, sir. John,
Just an anecdote,
a dam anecdote.
yeah, my point president walked the led a good contingent against Russell.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells this funny story about going to DC, Bobby, Fritz Holland. And I've never been to Washington, seen it, sat in the Senate office building, all the doors are open. You can see all the way to the center of the desk.
Uh-huh.
And when we got there, all the doors were open. There's Fritz Holland. He yelled down this long line, "Is that damn Joe Lassane here to argue with me about that damn dam?"
Yeah. Yeah. Well, obviously, and not only, not only did we lose those habitats, but these dams, what all is the historical sites that are all submerged beneath this. The human occupation going back. When I was on Paddle, Georgia one summer, and the water in the dam, we'd not had that much rain, and the water was low in the reservoir, and people were one person found this beautiful point about this long, and you were reminded that how much of that, of these relics, these information on the ground, places that Bartram visited, of course, Petersboro that's underwater, and what you get when you go to the interpretive center, like the Bartram Interpretive Center, is a picture of what used to be there and about how vital that was in terms of a pathway into northern Georgia and in the northern part of South Carolina. And so we have to focus. We don't have to, but I guess the only thing we can do is focus on what we still have and what we can restore. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I was kind of a little confused. The slide that had the map with the pie charts, was this the black and gray was hybrid?
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sure if you were saying that that's the number of hybrid fish versus original fish, or that's the percentage of genetics.
If you look in the population, if you go and you sample the fish, you catch fish, if you're a ichthyologist, that's the percentage of the hybrids that you catch. The others are if you look at the genetics, I couldn't tell one of these bass from the other, but so it's actually looking at the genetic array of the fish that you catch. And so the places where you still have the most unaffected fish genetically are in these smaller tributaries away from where you just get this big mix.
Fish that are hybridized.
That aren't. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think those are actually different species.
And they're different species.
Yeah.
They've got two different species. They don't, but then you can see that gray part where you can see what the proportion of hybrids are if you just go out and take the sample. Yes, ma'am. Wow. Great.